Well, thank you very much for the invitation for the conference, and especially the invitation to share some experience about a very important and delicate topic in psychotherapy. It's about the practice and methods of ethics. So to say, it is about, well, the values and the practical doing. Well, let me just share the basic agenda. I will share some experience about some ideas and experience about ethics, ethos, and morality, and the practice in organization and psychotherapy institution, and 2 case studies. And I will finish with some questions which are relevant when you look on an ethics committee on the values, and if there is a case, how to handle. Well, first of all, I want to share how I came across the topic of ethics in my job. First of all, I was a member of ethics committee in a training organization for quite a long time, and I'm engaged in ethics cases about relationship and sexual abuse, organizational power issues, and so on. And I was sometimes asked for ethics support by media, colleagues, organizations, at a court case. And of course, I had a long learning history of exchange of experience with colleagues who were suspected or accused. And of course, I published a lot about this topic, and I have experience because I was accused by some people by publishing about case studies. Well, there's a history how ethics became relevant for psychotherapy in the beginning, let's say, in the beginning of the 70s of last century. Psychotherapy as a helping work was done, based on personal values mostly. And then later on, there were some values derived from humanistic psychology. And the more the human growth movement developed, it started to be based on professional training and professional exchange of experience, which finally led to the development of organizations which offered psychotherapy training. And this, of course, was related with the more professionalization of the role of a psychotherapist. And this development finally, was more grounded in society because of the process of occupationalism. That means psychotherapy became an occupation being valued by society. And this, of course, led to the development of ethics committees within the organizations. And this, of course, produced more public awareness of the values in society and psychotherapy and how they were related. And the more this development was grounded in society, the more there was an interaction or integration of social norms and psychological norms and values. And yet one thing which is very astonishing is the following. Though most of the organizations, they claim for ethics, for an ethics committee, but the integration into the psychotherapy organization is not so, well established and well founded, well grounded in the organization as if expected and needed. So not all organizations have a good, well-grounded ethics policy and practice. First of all, I want to define ethics. It is in the field of psychotherapy, ethics can be understood as a determination, the development and definition of various relevant values and standards that underline one's own professional activity. These are usually written down in the ethics guidelines in the organization. Another aspect of the topic is morality, and this provides the concrete, relevant framework for action in the respective personal practice and as a member of an organization within one's own professional organization, which determines and regulates the desired, appropriate, and necessary behavior as a psychotherapist. And finally, ethos refers to the very personal morality and moral attitude of a person, or rather it describes the norms and standards, the orientation to which the individual aligns his personal behavior. This can, but does not, have to be in accordance with the respective ethics, the general values, the general orientation in the respective therapeutic organization. So you see, this is a very important distinction. And this distinction, this interplay, leads to the ethics discourse. So ethic guidelines, moral conduct recommendations, and the personal ethical conviction, the ethos of the individual, are closely related to each other. And the dynamics of the resulting field of tension requires a permanent discourse within the organization, a permanent further development, a change, adjustment, as well as expansion of orientation, behavior, and handling of violations, as well as sanctioning of the same if needed. This includes meaningfully and necessarily the review of sanctions. Well, most of the organizations have an ethics committee. And it is an independent body within the organization, as well as a guardian of the professional practice. So both the general orientation and the guardian. It has a dual function. It watches over the state of the art of psychotherapeutic school and the practice. And it has an administrative, juridical function within the organization. The ethics committee looks for transparency regarding the structure of the procedure in the sense of a fixed structure of rules and regulations, how to handle an ethics case. What has to be done if there is somebody accused by someone or if a case comes up. The ethics committee guarantees the decision-making within the organization and gives others outside the orientation and certainty that generally accepted rules are followed. And finally, it helps people to rely on a professional, independent procedure. When I look on the practice of ethics within the organizations, I found basically 6 different characterizations, you could say. The difference can be found within various organizations, and I mean, they mirror the development within the organization, the size of the organization, and the understanding and the consciousness within the organization related to ethic guidelines. So one is primarily based on announcement policy. The organization in such a case has basic values, ethic guidelines, but no further specific information on the role and function within the institute, nor any structures of procedure or rules of procedure being established. So they have ethic guidelines and maybe an ethics committee, but nothing else. So you don't know what will they do if somebody is accused for something. Another kind of organization or character of organization is based on mixed roles and lack of independency related to ethics. So they have ethical guidelines, but refer to a superordinate umbrella organization in terms of their application and implementation. For example, the European Association of Body Psychotherapy. Mostly, there are small institutes missing independency of ethics committee because they are so small, they're just like a family. Everybody knows each other and is related to one another. So they have maybe ethics guidelines and an ethics committee, but they don't handle an ethics case. They hand it over to the umbrella organization because they say we are too involved, so we cannot do it. The third character of organization is role and conflict of interest. These organizations have ethics guidelines, conditions of execution and implementation, but contradictory statements. And these can lead to conflicts of interest and role conflicts. For example, when you train students, when you do single therapy, and when you earn money by this, your income. So this is a deep role conflict. Another characterization of organization is the structural intransparency. So these organizations have ethic guidelines with differentiated descriptions of the conditions of execution and implementation, but limited to the consideration of the individual behavior of individual colleagues, and yet missing possible ethical violation by a committee of the association of members or members of a committee towards the association. So this often is connected with, so to say, power abuse in the organization. Another one is treatment in good faith. These organizations have ethic guidelines, conditions for application and implementation, but no specific body that after the adoption of possible sanctions controls this. So there are subtle implicit conflicts of roles and interests which can emerge that are not clearly identifiable at first glance. So you can trust them that they want to handle in good faith, but they don't know about, so to say, the blind spots within their role, their mixed roles, and the way how they handle an ethics case, how they communicate, how they inform each other or not. And finally, there is the last one, so to say, the state of the art. It's the ethically based and practically realized organizational practice. These organizations have ethic guidelines, conditions of execution and implementation, clear differentiation of different committees, and clear committee for controlling, for an extra committee for controlling. So to make it short, to bring it to the point, there are 4 aspects which embody the best practice, so to say, of an ethics procedure. There must be a permanent forum on questions of ethics within the organization. So a permanent discourse, a professional discourse on ethics in general, and not only 1 hour per year in the membership meeting. This is not enough, it's not good enough. It has to be established, well, on many perspectives during the year. Another aspect which is needed is the ethics committee. And this one deals with clients and organizational complaints, documents everything, and determines possible sanctions. And then there is the ethics council. This body in the organization is responsible for the implementation of the sanctions. It defines the rules for its own procedure. So to say, the ethics committee is responsible for the diagnosis and the indication, and the ethics council is responsible for the practical doing. And this is very important and not often to be found. There has to be an extra committee of inquiry. And this cannot decide by itself any rule or any procedure, just monitors the process. So this is, so to say, the body of controlling within the organization. I already mentioned the importance of the professional discourse within the organization. And this, of course, is a matter of, so to say, the power body within the organization. And there are some basic questions related to possible power abuse within the organization. So you could ask, what helps the organization to install a solid and effective ethics procedure? What are possible limitations? Perhaps you remember the small organizations of body psychotherapy and the European Association of Body Psychotherapy. They were too small, so they were limited. They cannot principally handle an ethics case by themselves. The second question, which can be important, is why does one organization succeeds better than the other? What are the differences? What makes it, better or worse? Or the third one is conflict can be between ethics reference to clients within the organization and having economical personal interest. And economical interest is when you earn your money, and personal interest can be when you are fixed to a role, or when you want to stay a member of a certain body within the organization. I know some organizations which have a board which is elected every 2 years or 3 years, and some board members, they are member of the board for about 15 or 20 years. So this implicitly is already a sign of power abuse, because you cannot be objective enough and distant enough. Another question is, how can one from outside recognize that sufficient transparency, independency, dialogue, separation of roles, trust, and so on are actually lived? So everybody in every organization will say, well, or ethics committee will say, we look for transparency, we are independent, we foster dialogue. But what are the criteria of this? Criteria by which somebody from outside can realize and prove, well, they are independent or not so independent, or independent in this way and not in the other way. And this is, I mean, a very important aspect which has to be discussed within the organization, and can change. Those criteria can change during the process of the years as a learning process. Another question is how to integrate, if needed, a specific ombudsman-like function from outside. Maybe, well, there are some institutes we have a lawyer or a priest or a manager in the ethics committee, so that there is at least some ombudsman function being embodied within the organization. So just like it is in society, there has to be distinction between legislative, executive, and judiciary need. So ethics is in constant discursive process within the organization and can never be conclusively defined. So it's an open process. It's a practice of, the practice of ethics is an interplay, a process within the organization which necessarily leads to decisions. And decision-making within the organization, especially when it is so small, it is a very difficult and delicate thing. But you cannot avoid decisions or change decisions, make new decisions. And these decisions need enough controlling and discourse within the organization and or with experts from outside, which I already mentioned. Because, and this is important to realize, because it is always ethical ambiguity in the field of psychological science. Ethical guidelines can change, the values can change, the procedure can change. So this can be supported, developed, and controlled by the organization itself. But, and this is most important in organizations, be aware that ethics always is a battlefield. There I refer to Foucault. And it is a territorial struggle. And I refer to Klaus Ottemeyer from Austria. This often leads to instrumentalization of ethics in the power discourse in the organization. So you cannot avoid that you touch the power system when you deal with an ethics case within the organization. This includes role conflict always, and diffusion, and always touches unconscious dynamics within the organization. You cannot avoid this vitalization of the unconscious dynamics in the organization. So you have to be aware of the single case which comes up and the herewith connected unconscious dynamics which are, so to say, vitalized within the organization. Here are two case studies. One is the initial situation, the sexual abuse and the relationship abuse by a board member. The board regulates this internally, says that the board member which was accused could stay as a board member and had to follow some single session and supervision. But there was no information to the ethics committee. And the ethics committee was informed by an anonymous report from outside. And the result was a subsequent involvement of the ethics committee, not as the first body in the organization to be contacted. The problem, part of the problem was it was an abuse of power by the board in the organization. Of course, it was sexual abuse. This was a personal case. So part of the problem is the incapacitation of the ethics committee. They ignored the ethics committee, though in the statutes, in the rules of the organization, it was written, you have to contact the ethics committee. Deficits in the organization with regard to independency, transparency, responsibility, consequences, and, well, respecting the own guidelines in the organization. Another part of the problem was the instrumentalization of the annual member meeting. And there the board said, or handed over the problem to the members and said, well, you decide what we have to do. This is impossible. And then the ethics committee in this organization said, well, let's look for a supervision, a mediation between the board and the ethics committee. And the board did not accept this. So at the end, no one could take ultimate responsibility. And the consequence was that 3 members of the ethics committee left the committee and the organization. The second case study, it's a publication of a case study. The situation is a publication of a case report, anonymously, of course, And it was coordinated before the publication started with the client. And there was a written commitment in this regard. And the therapist gave the paper to the client and asked for final commitment before being published. And yet, a mobilization started of emotional dynamics within the, in the client. He was overwhelmed by whatever, though he had committed completely that the paper could be published. And another aspect of the initial situation was the overriding complaint and lawsuit by the client. So the problem, part of the problem was, despite careful anonymization, agreement, and signed commitment, accusation of abuse was brought up. So it was an unavoidable dilemma for the therapist. And this usually can happen in every case when a therapist publishes about his client. And I know some colleagues who already had to suffer quite intensively under these complaints. Another aspect of the problem is the concrete threat and blackmail. And publicity before the situation had been clarified, because the client, based on his emotional dynamics, opened up some kind of a shitstorm before the case was clarified. So some typical difficulties and problems when you have to face ethics, the handling within the organization, or when you face an ethics case. So after a report to the organization, it takes sometimes months and years to handle the case which is brought up. And this is not respectful at all, and not in the sense of ethics guidelines. No one in the organization, as another aspect, feels responsible or treats the lawsuit. They send it to the umbrella organization, and then to the international organization, and then back, and so nobody feels really responsible. And or it is not really clear enough in the ethics guidelines how the procedure could be. Another aspect is the client is sent from A to B to C within the organization. And this process is, so to say, an organizational abuse of someone who trusts the organization and addresses the organization because of his very personal experience. Another aspect is who feels responsible or is structural responsible. The local institute, the umbrella organization, or the international organization. This has to be clear enough from the beginning, and especially clear enough for somebody who comes up with some complaint. Or when is it necessary to ask for specific expertise to handle the case? The ethics committee perhaps cannot do it completely by itself. Whom to ask, whom to address, or how to handle if the membership meeting always elects the same board member and they keep this role for too many years. I already referred to this aspect of organizational power abuse. Or do members of the ethics committee have other functions within the organization or not? If they have other functions, they really cannot be objective. What is needed to regard all relevant views on the case? How to find out? So sometimes it is very difficult and specific, challenge for an ethics committee. Or how can a second order observer, somebody from outside, realize sufficient independency and transparency within the organization? What are the criteria of transparency and independency? When does the procedure needs external support or has to be handed over to court? Because this is a limitation of the organization or the ethics committee. Or how is the organization or the ethics committee conscious about the difference between ethics within the organization and or the legal situation in society? And finally, how can someone from outside know whom to address? Because if you from outside want to address some ethics issue, these people, how to say, experienced a very deep shame already. And then to open up within the organization, it is another, so to say, difficult experience, because they have to open up something which they suffer from. So when they don't know where to go, to whom to address, many people, they don't open up with their ethics case. They keep it for themselves, and this is not a respectful way how to handle. So basic dilemma of ethics is the following, and I refer to an aspect in which is well stated and monitored in the United States. On the one hand, there is the ethical requirement not to comment on a public figure from a professional point of view. And this guideline, so to say, is set in, I think it was in the 60s of last century, by the American Association of Psychiatrists or Psychologists, I can't remember really. And they said, we as psychotherapists are not allowed to do any comment on a public figure from the psychological or psychotherapeutic perspective. On the other hand, and this is interesting, there is the so-called Tarasov doctrine, from which the necessity can even be derived to even have to speak out as a psychological or psychotherapeutic expert if there may be potentially dangerous consequences of the behavior. And this Tarasov doctrine dates back much earlier than the commitment of the Association of Psychologists or Psychiatrists. So if there is a possible danger, or if you want to refer to some basic pattern which is connected with this case, and you have to open up. So this dilemma is a dilemma on, so to say, the big stage in society, the media stage. But this dilemma also refers to many, how to say, experiences within an organization when handling an ethics case. I refer to the professional discourse within the organization. And this is an experience as a learning history, I will call it. And the learning history is, so to say, the process of documenting one's own development, learning, and analytic efforts to increase self-awareness as an organization and as a single therapist. It touches own understandings and relationship to a new field of experience, because each case is a new experience, including reports of actions and findings. It shows from my learning, the organizational learning is an approach to become familiar with what I do, where I do it, with whom I do it, or why I don't do it. It illustrates how I achieved my results and how I documented them. Learning history is, so to say, a way to document and to improve the learning methods and the aspects of interventions in the one or the other case. My underlying assumptions and reasonings, which in this case help me to become familiar with an unfamiliar context. So this has to be experienced well enough, developed and documented, so that other generations or other cases or other ethics committee can rely on this experience, relate to this experience, and can take some support out of it. And it also serves as a critical element in developing one's own research structure. Because ethics, as I told you, the interplay of ethics, morality, and ethos is a learning process, a development process. So as a learning history, it also, how to say, is part of an internal research process, an internal process within the organization, a learning process. Some basic questions, and I want to come to the end, which are important in my perspective, my experience. Do you, as a professional organization, embody the state of the art? So perhaps you remember the ethics committee, the procedure, the independency, intransparency, and so on. And how can somebody from outside can become aware of this? By what criteria can he acknowledge, well, it is like this? How can you support or improve the ethics discourse within your organization? How is your learning history, your learning process, your discourse structured and documented? And how it is lived, how is it lived within the organization? Another question is, how do you handle implicit and explicit role diffusion or conflict when you realize that it is there? What to do then? In how far is everybody in your organization aware of possible power issues and how to address or handle them? Because power issue means mostly that the bodies of an organization are involved. And this is not an easy game, believe me. What are your limitations in the organization or the ethics committee? Are you aware of this? If not, how can your organization still act responsibly with its blind spots? Everybody has blind spots, but it's a necessity to be aware of the fact that there will be or could be blind spots, and how to support yourself, how to maybe follow some mediation or supervision. How is your organization prepared for an ethics crisis, which can no longer be handled by the organization itself? What to do then? How do you handle the conflict between training, personal therapy, and economic interests? This is a very delicate issue, and because most of the institutes, they offer training, they offer self-experience, they offer professional discourse, and of course offer the possibility to earn money. To sum up, it is always important the clarification of needs, interests, implications, roles, mandates, and order in the beginning. You cannot just start handling a case or becoming member of an ethics committee or establishing a procedure. This is not easy at all. And it is also necessary to have a good monitoring during the procedure, in case there will be a change, conflict, diffusion, or whatever. And I know quite a lot of institutes or organizations, we don't have a fixed procedure how to handle. And this is not helpful at all and risky. So one basic quintessence out of my experience and the questions which I came across is the following. It seems to be very simple and yet very hard at the same time to be aware of the necessity of the ethics, state of the art, perhaps you remember. Develop and improve transparency, independency, clarity, openness, and so on. Guidelines are important. Even more important is a transparent official procedure. Vitalize the ethics discourse in the organization. Yes, some literature in German and English, and some general, so to say, ethic guidelines and procedures by umbrella organizations. And I thank you very much for listening and watching. And if you need some, not support, I mean, just if you have a question, just let me know and I will try to answer as soon as I can. And I can encourage you not to be too lazy, you know, with the state of the art or the establishing of the state of the art, to define the guidelines, the procedure, and guarantee the controlling, the supervision and the controlling. So I thank you very much for listening and watching, and wish you a nice time. So bye-bye. Bye-bye.